nor'easter, this New York nor'easter. You didn't know it was a nor'easter? Yes, yeah, you could get blown away. So we're taking shelter from the storm here at the Players Club, and welcome to our October event for the New York Society for General Semantics, coming hot off of this past weekend's Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture and Tyranny of Words Symposium, sponsored by the Institute of General Semantics, and a reminder, as always, that we bring these events to you without any charge or any solicitation, but we do ask, that if you like what you see and if you're interested, that you become members of the Institute of General Semantics, and with that you would get a subscription to the quarterly journal, etc., a review of General Semantics, founded by S.I. Hayakawa, edited for 10 years by Neil Postman, and now being edited by Tom Gencarelli, one of Neil's students like Sal. And also, we do accept donations. There on the website there is a donation link in case you're so moved. We're happy to receive it, but no pressure. And we're glad you're all here, and so welcome to Politics and Public Discourse 2019, a panel discussion. And I'll just read the little write-up that I put together. General Semantics was founded in a response to a call for sanity in political affairs domestically and globally. Alfred Korzybski, the founder of General Semantics, argued that our leaders and government officials need to have the same respect for reality as our scientists and engineers. This requires careful evaluation and constant reevaluation of our perceptions of the world and the ways in which we think and talk about what is going on around us. To that end, the New York Society for General Semantics has held periodic panel discussions devoted to the political landscape, to present-day language and symbolic action, to the talk and drama of our current democratic culture. At this perilous moment in the United States and worldwide, we return again to considering the uses and abuses of language in public discourse and the ways in which our candidates for office, our public officials, and our journalists create competing maps of our political terrain. Okay, and our expert panel, I know you're all excited to meet them, and I will start on my immediate left, my colleague, Jessica Baldwin-Filippi, who's an associate professor in Fordham University's Communication and Media Studies Department and an expert in the study of digital campaigning. Her first book, entitled Using Technology, Building Democracy, Digital Campaigning and the Construction of Citizenship, which was published in 2015, investigates the digital strategies and tactics that electoral campaigns adopted in a post-Obama social media era use. She's currently working on a book about data-driven campaigning leading up to the 2020 election, and her research informs op-ed writers at the New York Times, I am told.
Just today. Very excited.
That is nice.
Okay, and to Jesse's left is Salvador J Malachor. Sal was born in Brooklyn, New York. We forgive him for that. He earned his doctorate at New York University, where he studied under Neil Postman and Terry Moran, names familiar to many in our society. It's also where he teaches courses in propaganda and spectacle culture in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication. and he presented the media ecology of paparazzi. You like these Italian words, right, Sal? Yeah. Recently at the MEA, the Media Ecology Association Convention in Toronto. He also presented Early Dylan, the Contemporary Anachronism at the Dylan Archives this past June, and he's working on a project entitled Norman Mailer and Celebrity Culture. You know who Norman Mailer was?
Yes.
It's a question, right?
Yes, he lived in Brooklyn Heights.
It's Brooklyn people. I don't know what to do with them. And he was awarded the Excellence in Teaching Award from the Steinhardt School of Education at NYU.
Yay,
And to Sal's left, Isabelle Vincent is an award-winning investigative reporter for the New York Post and author of several books. She's a former foreign correspondent working in Latin America, Africa, and the Balkans, and her work has appeared in numerous publications all around the world, including The Guardian, that's England, right?
Yeah.
The New Yorker, that's around here, right? And New York Times Magazine. She's won the Yad Vashem Award for Holocaust History, the Jewish Book Award from Canada, and most recently an Associated Press Award for investigative reporting. Her most recent book, Dinner with Edward, is being made into a feature film starring English actor David Suchet.
Agatha Christie. He did Hercule Poirot.
And who's directing that?
Oh, no, we don't know yet.
You don't know?
Yeah.
If it's not J.J. Abrams, I'm not interested. Just kidding.
I love him.
He's great.
And she's currently working on a book about opera and the Second World War. Is that right?
Oh.
Okay. So these are our panelists.
Very cool.
Your applause is very welcome. And much appreciated. And to start off, I've asked them to each speak for a few minutes and give us, what they think is going on. In General Semantics, we have an acronym WIGO, which stands for What is Going On? And we're asking, what is going on here? What do you think is going on right now? And we'll start with Jesse. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to talk less about content. This might be a little bit risque for the semantics group, but I'm making a bold choice. So I want to talk a little bit about how contemporary discourse, excuse me, is a little less about content, or at least about more than just content. But especially I want to talk about how language is treated by platforms a little bit, more than just the language that is out there. I think there are many obvious things we can talk about our current contemporary political discourse and the content of it, but I particularly am interested in how that content gets treated by platforms. So just last week, right, we have kind of this kind of major fiasco of Facebook deciding that it's not, or making it public that it's not going to moderate or censor the content of paid ads, when in fact that whether that content might be true or misleading, or walking the line between misleading or totally very obviously misleading or fake or anything like that, right? And I think this that like kind of moment, one that we can all kind of think about at top of mind, raises this question of like not just moderating content and what ought platforms to do and whether or not we think that platforms should be moderating ads. Of course, we have a long history of our many media outlets in fact making choices about if they are going to run ads ahead of time that the digital platforms have chosen not to do. Right, so digital platforms are different than TV and radio and all of our other traditional media in this particular way, and that they don't look at the ads before they run them. They rely on a post-fact kind of reaction to them and decisions about if they should moderate them. And even before that conversation of if they should take down content, I want to ask everyone to think a little bit more about how we think about Facebook, not just in terms of censoring or leaving up content or taking it down, but in fact about how it enables reach and amplification of content. And so if we take the case of a misleading ad like we had kind of last week, right, we had the major news outlets publishing or highlighting the fact that the Trump campaign runs this like misleading ad, and the question is, should Facebook allow that to exist, right? I kind of think, and a lot of other scholars have begun to say, the question is not should Facebook censor that. There are actually very real kind of concerns about Facebook's ability to moderate fairly, in a timely fashion, kind of big firms versus little firms, not just kind of which side of the aisle will they agree with. But the question that scholars have kind of studied digital politics in this kind of area have really want people to turn to is, should platforms amplify that content if in fact it has been up, right? And so Facebook, for instance, actually tends to amplify this content. And the way that the algorithms work, they haven't changed them so that they can kind of, they put a tamper on that. Twitter has made an opposite decision, basically, in saying that they will leave that content up, right, paid or unpaid, but in fact they will take steps not to amplify it, right? And so in this, I would like kind of us to think about the conversation about what political speech ought to be there, less about censoring or what should be and shouldn't be allowed, and more about what should and shouldn't be amplified. And I think that that's an important kind of thing to grapple with in terms of what discourse is available to us as a public. And so I think that's kind of the cutting edge of what we should be turning toward, rather than just what should and shouldn't be present, what should and shouldn't be given more attention, or given kind of the underpinnings of helping us give them attention more. That's at least a starting point.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. And Sal, what's on your mind?
Well, when Lance suggested that question, what concerns me the most about language and politics right now is what has concerned me for the last 5 years or so, when Trump started his run for the presidency, and especially with his birtherism campaign against President Obama, and then his successful run for the presidency. And I can edit that concern down to 7 words: everything he says and everything he does. But my concern about Trump's abuse of language really doesn't begin with Trump. I could go back to Nixon in 1968, who co-opted the language of the civil rights movement, and saying in one of his political ads that the first civil right of every American is law and order, notwithstanding the fact that law and order was used systematically to create the laws and the order that kept African Americans from participating in public life, and especially from voting. I could go back to the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan. Reagan, of course, had a tranquil and soothing manner, unlike Trump. But like Trump, he had a rhetorical propensity to just make things up. Reagan was one of our extraordinary fabricators, although I think Trump continues to out-fabricate him. One of Reagan's most famous fabrications was that trees cause more pollution than automobiles. Some of you might remember that.
No.
And he maintained, wrongly, that sulfur dioxide emitted from Mount St. Helens was greater threat than automobile emissions, although he said over 10 years. So the press in those days, like the press today, corrected him, but it apparently didn't matter to his supporters. And while I'm at it, let's not forget the redoubtable George W. Bush, who, to my astonishment, is looking a lot better to some people as president, because this one is just so bad. And Bush, as you folks know, was no stranger to the lie, was he? No stranger to the big lie. The big lie of weapons of mass destruction is perhaps the one of the most consequential lies in recent American history. But as for Trump, His lies, his misstatements, his self-aggrandizing manner with facts and statistics, and his rhetorical fumbles have become a significant part of public discourse. And I think that's his point. That's what he wants to do. I think we see in Trump a rather ignorant and socially oblivious and historically uninformed, but an extraordinarily entertaining individual. And because he doesn't know anything about the presidency or about policy, he will do what he knows how to do. That is, he will manipulate the press and he will entertain the public. Sometimes he will entertain the public by manipulating the press. And this is why he takes issue, actually why he is at war with the press, which I think we can discuss further in the Q&A. And I don't think I'm telling anyone here anything new as to how easy it seems for Trump to tag the press and his opponents with clever and offensive names, such as enemy of the people and others. I think you folks know what I'm talking about. And he makes that point the focal point of public discourse and public commentary. And while we're busy complaining or explaining or analyzing this corrosive turn in public discourse, his administration and his allies in the federal and state governments roll back consumer protection, roll back environmental protections, roll back voting protections, and roll back reproductive rights. So my concern, to answer Lance finally, is with Trump's cunning abuse of language, his debasement of language. Consider one thing he said about 2 weeks ago when talk of impeachment became prominent. Trump said in one of those driveway press conferences that nervous Nancy Pelosi and little Adam Schiff were guilty of treason and must be immediately impeached. It's a variant of one of Trump's defensive remarks during his debates with Hillary Clinton, right? No puppet, you're the puppet. You can't impeach me, I impeach you. In this way, he debases the word impeach, making it just another insult, as opposed to the political process that it is. But what also concerns me is his public obscenity. Now, many of you know me, and you know that I'm not a prude, but Trump's use of obscenity as president is really unprecedented. He has no respect for his office, or it seems for his audiences, and his obscenity has become more blatant recently. At a political rally last Friday in Louisiana, Trump commented on his upcoming impeachment inquiries and declared, without any recourse to evidence, that the Democrats know they cannot beat him next year, so they're pursuing an illegal, invalid, and unconstitutional bullshit impeachment. Everything about that statement is wrong, misleading, and false. And no one in this room is surprised, and almost everyone at that rally believed him. Trump's legacy up to this point is not just his incessant incivility, nor his dehumanizing language to justify the cruelty of his policies. The consequences of this language and his approach to public discourse are intentional. It is to open the door, so to speak, so that other public figures can get away with making things up as well. For authoritarians like Trump and his Republican cohort, language is a weapon deployed in the service of an emotional half-truth, something his followers, elected or otherwise, believe to be true, even if it isn't. Thank you.
But what do you really think? Well, okay. Isabelle, I know that as an investigative reporter, you're not going to get into taking
Anything
sides.
professorial either.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to relate my experience as a reporter at this paper. This is where I work, the New York Post. Oh, sorry.
Doesn't matter, we got it.
Yeah.
I hear it was founded by Alexander Hamilton.
It was founded by Alexander Hamilton, but I came to the Post, I have to preface everything I say with the fact that I'm from Canada. I guess I became a reporter on a much more genteel, nice newsroom where people didn't yell at each other and.
Speak a little louder.
Yeah. So I was saying that I started my career at a paper called the Globe and Mail, which is, I guess, the equivalent of the New York Times in Canada, and it was a nice place. I mean, we were all very civil to each other. I didn't really know what I was getting into at the Post, but people scream in the newsroom. My first story for the Post, my editor called me over. It was a story about a corrupt charity, and he looked at it and he erased it on the screen, and then and I'd been a reporter by then for 25 years or so, and he said, "This is how you write a story." And I actually learned from that, because I learned to write very short. I learned, believe it or not, not that I had an opinion before, but I learned that the very basics needed to be in that first paragraph, which is very important. I'll get to that. Anyway, when I started reading, and another thing I want to say is that I am not really a consumer of news because I don't watch TV news here, and I had to watch TV news when I was covering the border a few months ago. I was sent to Texas to cover all the southern states along the border with Mexico. And so I turned on the TV, watched CNN, Mueller report, and I didn't understand what they were saying. And then I turned on Fox, and I just wanted the facts, and nobody was giving me the facts. It was just so, maybe you guys can talk about this afterwards. It was so saturated with opinion that I didn't quite understand. So I turned on the BBC, and then I understood it. And my experience in reading other journalists and looking on, I look at what people say on Twitter. I could not believe that during the campaign you had reporters who were covering the campaign and who were covering Trump with an opinion on Twitter about Trump. It usually was about Trump. And I was like, in my newspaper in Canada and at the Post, I would be fired for doing something like that. But there was, for some reason, it was okay. This I didn't like. Now, one of the stories I wrote during the campaign, I'm not a political reporter, but I happened to find the nude pictures of Melania Trump in France, of all places, that she had taken when she was an aspiring model, and this was in the mid-90s. So, I brought them to the Post. I said, "This is Melania." It didn't look like her because of the plastic surgery and everything else, but I did this story. We got 19 million hits on it, and what was interesting about it, and the reason other people picked it up was because Trump was going on about illegal immigrants and people not having the right visas. Well, hello. I don't think she had her visa at that time, but so that's why it spawned this worldwide interest in when did Melania get her working papers. Okay, but the whole atmosphere around Trump was so shrill that I was getting calls from other reporters at other newspapers who wanted to know if he had leaked me the pictures. And I'm like, really? And the reason they asked that was did he do that to take emphasis away from something else? Because at that time he had the Muslim couple were very upset at him for what he had said about their son.
Right. Gold stuff on.
That's right. So they said, "Oh, he must be. This is a diversion." But I can tell you, it was not a diversion. I've never spoken to him. I legitimately found these pictures that were really hiding in plain sight, but nobody had seen them. We published them, and again, it created this whole thing. But I was shocked that people thought I was part of this vast conspiracy.
Oh.
And that's what I mean by, maybe it's not language, but it's this shrill kind of point of view. I mean, on my level, the working reporters, that, oh, of course, if you have this, he must have been behind it. But I'll tell you what happened at the Post is that we took those pictures, one of my colleagues took those pictures to Donald Trump of his wife, and because we weren't sure it was her, they were taken so long ago, and she'd obviously had work done, and so he took the pictures, and if he had said, no, that's not my wife, we wouldn't have run them. I mean, but he said, oh yeah, that's her, and he was very proud of it. This is when she was like, these were artistic shots, like this was so great. So, my point is that, I understand why people are upset at the president, but I also think that the language, the point on the level of journalists has gone a little bit crazy. Like, there's no even-handedness sometimes. Like, I'm not saying all the time, but that is my point.
Well, we'll take questions later. We certainly have an interesting assortment of points, and I do want to note that the question of the structure of language and the structure of communication is very much at the heart of what we're interested in general semantics. And I'd also point out that just this past Friday we had the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture given by Nadine Strawson, former head of ACLU. So very much to the point of how we communicate and what is okay or not okay to talk about. So I think we have, interesting set of balls kind of in the air to juggle, and maybe we'll hear some responses to each other. And Jesse, do you want to
Sure.
go off on this? On any of this?
Yeah. Actually, just to kind of speak to the question of journalism as kind of the obvious intermediary for how we get a lot of the content that we do from all of our elected officials and how we hear that language again. I'm curious to get your perspective. Mine would be that coverage in some ways, partially because of a digital environment, but partially because, or at least this question is raised in light of recent political circumstances, but the question of should how journalism works, if not change radically, take a step back to reflect upon kind of the work that is being done, right? So the instance of this thing is newsworthy because I found it and it relates to an actually important kind of political topic about visas and immigration, right? Then what is the kind of question of when that coverage is important too, and how it doesn't take away from other
It's not just the nude pictures. Although I admit I work for the Post.
They're right. And think about the tabloid fact of that too, right? And even how that intersects with the question of how do journalists cover a lie, right? Is it newsworthy just because it's a lie, right? A lot of scholars, mostly Whitney Phillips, has written a ton about kind of how you shouldn't actually just amplify the lie in covering it, right? There actually are best practices that are different and almost, in fact, kind of opposite of traditional journalistic practice, which would just be say the thing that they said and then fact check it, right? But kind of calling for a radical shift in how coverage works, partially in light of the digital environment in which things spread, right? And partially perhaps because...
Are you saying because it spreads so quickly?
Yeah, and because then the fact check doesn't get picked up, right?
That's
in the headline, and then there's limited space, and also if it's in a second tweet, the second tweet doesn't get picked up, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
It's
and
just
so I'm
there's
curious,
because things are done in real time now, so reporters are going on, they're at press conferences and they're putting stuff on Twitter right away.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it's good that I guess people can react to that, but you're right, there's no fact checking in those 30 seconds.
Yeah,
But-
and so that question of kind of, what does that mean for, we've had pretty standard journalistic values, norms, right? And we agree upon their large-scale normative values behind them, right? Like it's good to
comment. You can understand why a journalist is really interested in whether Trump leaked them to you. Right? You can understand that.
I can understand it,
Yeah,
but.
because the news leak is in fact how news gets reported. The news leak, a kind of pseudo event, is meant to do something, to engage publicity, to engage visibility. And so the reporters would, that's their instinct, is to say, this was obviously leaked by Trump. And even though you found it on your own, or an editor found it for you in France, and you said it was hiding in plain sight, how did it get there? In a sense, it probably, and of course the fact that he said, yes, that's my wife, that sort of muddies the water in everything. That sort of deflects from everything else. It deflects from the Gold Star family. It deflects from any kinds of issues. And it becomes, and then you can go on to, and you can say, see, the press is insulting my wife, or the press is being nasty by publishing these pictures. I don't know if you did that or not, but you know what I'm saying.
No, I mean,
Right.
I agree with you.
But I'm
See, I'm a conspiracy theorist.
No, that's not a conspiracy.
No, but
That's not a conspiracy. That's the way news leaks operate. That's the way, that's the way organized political, that's the way political organizations operate. It's not, they do present a kind of pseudo event to the public. Right?
No, but I can tell you, this was not like an odd research,
Right.
anything. It was stupid, dumb luck that I happened to be on vacation, and I talked to a guy who knew the photographer who had done the pictures. That's how it happened, and I'm like, oh, no, it's done it. Checked on the book who hadn't been done, and we bought the pictures.
There's this principle, right? And there's the purpose of something, and then there's the function of something, right? So, right, the purpose here was not terribly clear, but how it functions in the media ecosystem is something else. But that's not what I really think is that as important as the other obscenity aspect, obscene aspects of his language.
The obscenity piece is also interesting because in terms of like the ads that have gotten taken down in digital platforms in particular, a lot of ads have been bounced for obscenity because in the context of a 30-second video spot, he will say son of a bitch or something like that. And so like a ton of ads have gotten bounced for Facebook in particular for that, among other kind of low-level interest, like the kind of like minutia and like millions of paper cuts of like, oh, it has a fake button, you can't do that. That's against the tiny rule, right? You can't have obscenity there, so that gets taken off, but kind of dispels the discussions or decisions about what should happen with a piece of content that is also full of like things that we would be very comfortable calling lies, right? That aren't even like kind of in that gray zone of like attack ads, or that we might be like, oh, I don't know, we can make a case for kind of how this is pitched persuasively too. So that's an interesting like.
The tradition in political speech is that anything goes. I mean, there's no
Well,
no
that's not
law.
entirely true actually,
Yeah,
because
there's nothing.
no, there's no law, but TV, especially network, and also a lot of cable companies bounce ads a lot for not being truthful enough.
No,
They do, right? They actually
You
do.
can go back into the history of political advertising and political commercials on radio, on television, and on Facebook, and you will find. Right?
Oh yeah, there are lies.
Explicit, they are not taken down. I mean, they accused Goldwater of being a member of the Ku Klux Klan in 1964. They accused John Kerry of murdering somebody in 2004. Now those ads were not taken down.
Some are though. Like I agree. There are many lies that we can point out in TV ads,
Right.
but there is this discretion. There is at least a claim to, and occasionally acted upon claim to prior review, basically, which is structurally different than post-fact waiting for moderation and flagging. Right?
And quite frankly, with political ads, whether they're on Facebook, Twitter, or television, it's not the explicit lie that's the problem, right?
Yeah, it's the dog
It's
whistle.
the
yeah,
disinformation
yeah.
that's the problem, right? The pardon my language, the bullshit. That's the problem, right?
Edit
So-
that, please. Edit that, please.
So that it doesn't get taken down by the Facebook guy.
Bold.
Oh, you better take it off
Strike
of
that.
YouTube.
Strike that.
Bolded,
And
yeah.
not posted on Facebook, if we're off of Facebook.
Yeah.
We just stick with YouTube, we're okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, yeah, but I actually do think that makes then the getting kicked out for cursing kind of all the more silly, right? And like missing the forest for the trees, right? Because like you're failing to make an attempt to navigate other stuff, right? Whereas you're like, cursing.
But here's also the thing.
Well, that
about-
gives you kind of a neutral criteria.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
you know, because
Yeah.
you can't evaluate the opinion or the position.
It's neutral. It's also incredibly easy for underpaid workers who are contracted without benefits in the U.S. or foreign workers who make $1 a day, usually in the Philippines, sometimes in India, to moderate this stuff too, right? Like, which is integral to how the platform functions. So, like, yeah, I can follow that rule.
But what do you make of like the new Twitter rules that they just came out with?
So I actually think that the non-amplifying rules part are interesting for that reason. Like you can make, I think reasonable people can disagree about if you think a platform which is literally private speech, right, not a public sphere exactly, right, they could moderate it if they wanted, they could censor it if they wanted. I think reasonable people can disagree about what should be allowed there for political kind of people, if they should be held to a different standard than I should be if I'm tweeting something mean to someone. But if I would say historically, in recent history, the platforms have been very bad, not just like in the partisan way of which speech to allow, but in a way that basically they are very close to people and groups with a lot of money, political organizations and campaigns with lots of money, and their stuff gets kept up, whereas the same down ballot race stuff gets taken down because they don't have those relationships.
Unlike traditional media.
There's more content to take down. So maybe time. You're right. Maybe like in terms of who gets their faces there in
How about ads,
speech.
suppression of news in traditional media?
What do you mean?
I happen to know on a first-hand basis, Geico, all the commercials, you can't say a blessed thing wrong about Warren Buffett in public because they'll pull your ad for Geico, which Berkshire Hathaway owns.
He'll pull your ad for Geico.
Berkshire Hathaway owns Geico.
I don't know. I don't know how to.
A lot of Geico ads out there, right?
Yeah.
What is
I don't know.
So I happen to know people in the media who do this, and they say that if someone's going to say something negative about somebody who happens to control a large part of advertising, it has to go through management. And
Oh, I mean,
management
that's
decisions whether to run the article
Yeah.
that might have a negative tinge to it or not.
Yeah,
And they
totally, yeah.
oftentimes will not because of the income structure.
Or like in newspapers, you don't want to. You're like, oh, we're not going to run the anti-whatever campaign because they buy your ads.
Specifically
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
Berkshire
No, that's
Hathaway,
good.
you
Yeah.
can't hear a blessed thing wrong about Warren Buffett or Berkshire Hathaway. Geico spends a lot of money on marketing, and so the financial news media out there largely will never say something cool because they know they'll get the marketing pull. Is that fair? Is that,
We're not really talking about fairness necessarily either, right?
in a modern sense.
Well, we're trying to really deal with the situation of language right now.
Right.
There are all kinds of pressures. A colleague I know from long ago did a analysis. So it was kind of qualitative and quantitative of newspaper coverage in different cities, and found that the coverage of abortion varied according to Catholic population in cities. The cities with higher Catholic population tended to be kind of more against abortion as opposed to other cities. And partly that's knowing your audience and appealing to your audience. There are all kinds of pressures. That do
That's
exist.
metadata, right? Isn't that what your specialty is?
What?
Is the processing of metadata with the modern social media platform?
Yeah.
To decide where you should target your audience.
Yes. Which happy to speak about how stuff is targeted, but also those are not as exact sciences as they often seem either, right? The kind of the questions of doing that targeting work. I think that's like a fascinating kind of like related question.
But there is an interesting question here about obscenity. I'm going to come back to that, and the question of what is considered obscene and in what context, and it's clear that the boundaries that exist have been pushed. I mean, I think The Sopranos did a lot of that earlier on, but I think what Sal's referring to
But not
particularly.
just that, with all these scandals, Me Too, and with the latest, like, let's move to that with Matt Lauer, like,
Yeah.
the rape that came, the rape that was reported last week, like, I didn't need to know did we need to know all the information about that? I don't know how people feel about that. Like that.
Let me just, I'm old
It
enough.
was fairly graphic, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very graphic.
I'm old enough to remember the 90s. And during the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton, the Republicans, led by Ken Starr, made the consensual act between Monica Lewinsky and Bill, did it graphically. It was on the internet, believe it or not. And you could read, this is what I did, this is what he did, this is what I did. So, the problem of obscenity in public discourse is, we go way back. I'm not talking so much about the kind of obscenity that's in art, that's in fiction, or that's in something like The Sopranos. I'm talking about the kind of public discourse that you would that a president or a senator or a congressman, or that even a public school teacher would be responsible for. I mean, I'm making a distinction, right? In art, anything goes. We had that test case in 1960 when Howell was, or Lady, it wasn't Lady Chatterley's Love, but what's the book by Henry Miller? Tropic of Cancer. How could I forget?
Well, how about Vanessa Williams? Remember the case of Vanessa
yeah.
Williams? Right,
Miss
that was a
America.
Miss America who was stripped of her title for when New Pictures came out, and she was referred to as Vanessa the Undresser, maybe by the New York Post. But I mean, at that point, is saying that this is crossing a line, and that that this is inappropriate for Miss America. Now, when we talk about Melania, I think in other circumstances, wouldn't that be considered crossing a line and inappropriate? That you could, that this is so shameful that you would have to basically go into hiding and couldn't be, a public figure anymore. But in this case, it's just sort of like, oh, that's art, it's okay.
Right, and it was during the campaign. It wasn't First Lady. And I mean, the big question, and what I still think is a question, is when was she allowed to work in the United States? And that all got.
It's censorship.
We're being beeped out here, yes. Well, I think that's a good question, but isn't there also a question of why did that turn out to be unexceptional rather than, being frankly a cause to resign, from the candidacy, in the way that Al Franken, having these photographs where he's kind of clowning around, that led to him resigning from the Senate.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good question.
To answer that, I read this really interesting thing online, very quick. There's a recent study just about the results that happen when a political figure is accused of something. And if they apologize, the likelihood that they will then go on to resign is much, much higher than if they don't apologize, especially if it's about offending another group. So I just think Trump's inability to apologize accounts for that.
Well, also it's about his proving abandonment as a come on, the whole big side thing, everything about Trump is really about
That's a good
reducing
point.
my candidacy,
Well,
my masculinity.
I don't want to get into that.
Right,
But your notion of not apologizing or having a non-apology apology is a rhetorical strategy. They do that for a reason, as you probably know, right? It's not so much, because when you do apologize, and there's a whole rhetorical tradition about prologia, you can go all the way back to the Greeks. In the modern American media environment, an apology is considered weakness, not a matter of
Stepping up.
morals, or not a matter of being polite, or not a matter of trying to personally take responsibility. It's always seen, and that's why you will get people apologizing, right? I mean, at least in public.
Like the governor of Virginia.
But look, I think we need to make a distinction here and going back to Jesse's point about norms, right? That we're violating norms, but, and in this sense, recreating what they are, because Nixon didn't apologize for Watergate, but he resigned. And, and in his resignation speech, he framed it as doing us a favor,
Right.
as sacrificing in order to allow the government to function. So made himself out to be the hero. But he still realized, that there are norms being violated. I mean, we talk about political norms being violated, but there's also what you were getting at was journalistic norms and coverage norms being violated.
And I think even norms about civility too, right? Which is related to the idea of obscenity. Interestingly, like our normative ideas about what political discourse should be are about like rational, and like maybe we've said, okay, some emotion is okay, right? We're kind of okay with that now. But it should be civil and it should look a certain way. Fascinatingly, a bunch of people who study how people interact with pieces of journalism, on Twitter in particular, who kind of study it from the idea of like making discourse better, have started to find that like civility is actually not necessarily as productive as we normatively would like to think it is.
Yeah.
So you can call someone a mean name in Twitter when talking about a piece of news, right, or something that a political candidate said, and still have like a robust deliberation and discussion kind of following that we, if you were looking for incivility and like meanness, you would be like bad, right? But if you then start to look at reciprocating and kind of engaging, that there are actually productive things happening there. So it's also kind of, how might these norms be changing in ways that we are probably perhaps not normatively comfortable with?
But I think that there's a difference between what Lance is saying. It's a difference between, like on Twitter, I don't do this, but if I'm arguing with somebody on Twitter, right, and I say, she's a Russian asset, or somebody says, you should be, I'll get my AR-15 on you, or something like that. By the way, I had that guy blocked and dropped from Twitter. Okay, just to give you an idea. But there's a difference between us having a conversation, and there's a difference between a public figure making a rhetorical statement or creating a piece of discourse. There's a difference with that. So I can engage in incivility, among my friends or even among my enemies. But if I'm going to give a public speech as congressman from the 3rd District, there's a level, I think, of language that needs to be followed.
Decorum, kind of.
Yeah, something like that. Now that has been broken, and that has been broken.
But do you think that happens because of the fact that you've only got a certain amount of characters on Twitter too? Like you have to be short, and like how does that play into it?
I think that's a really good point, because the form obviously does, in a sense, shape content. And Twitter, what do we have, 140? Is that
Now
what it is?
240,
Yeah.
but actually research,
280.
we're 280, yeah, right, it doubled. Research showed that then conversations did become more deliberative when the size doubled, and that they think that that's about the amount that you need in the English language to do justice to ideas. Interestingly, like and that actually was kind of this discussion was like in other languages you probably could get away with fewer, and that's kind of was part of the doubling. Interestingly, the insults are usually just superfluous, right? Like if you're trying to like conserve language, yeah, but like so like differing things I think kind of are at play there. I think it speaks to an interesting.
It's a different norm.
Yeah.
If in a debate you decide to insult your opponent, that's something that I don't think is actually productive in terms of
Good
persuasion.
attention.
In terms of persuasion, because I remember having debates with my father about abortion, and my father would say to me, "Oh, okay, so you believe in murder? You do," and then that would stop conversation, right? It doesn't create a kind of flow, right? It just stops everything.
And so talking about like the need to persuade versus the need to mobilize base too, right? If we're talking about political campaigns in particular, you have two pretty divergent needs
Right.
in terms of activating people who are even kind of committed to you, right? Versus persuading someone who's not, right? And fascinatingly, like digital media allow you to do the mobilizing thing, the like getting people who already kind of are into you or quite into you to do something for you, to
Right.
do more.
Right.
But that's what digital is much better at, right? Like
Yeah.
you can target people who you're actually more likely to know a lot more information about people who like you a little bit, right? Or have registered to vote and voted for your, or at least have registered to vote for your party and have voted in the previous 3 elections, let's say. It's much more likely, it's much easier to target people who are somewhat to vary on your side and create numbers deciding how on your side they are and then how likely to turn out they are. And that's the meat of what digital is best for, right?
That follows the trend, I think, in political campaigns, at least for the last 20 years, right? They're not elections in which we want to persuade the middle or the undecided. We just want to, it's a base election. I have to get more, it started, the Southern strategy with Nixon in '68, they decided to go after the white vote because obviously they were against civil rights, so they weren't going to get the black vote. So they created an atmosphere and a strategy that would play on white resentment, right? So that they just, these are the votes I want, right? And that has gone from '68 through all the way to 2016.
Yeah.
I think that's what's happened.
So Lance, can I ask?
Well, this sounds very much like kind of Neil Postman's sort of analysis, the decline of rational discourse. Rational discourse would be about persuasion and people presenting different points of view, as opposed to going back to the very abbreviated discourse of Twitter. I do wonder, even with 280, I think sort of it's slogans, it's headlines, it's telegraphic discourse.
But it's a little bit about what I was talking about. My editor forced me to be very concise in that first paragraph, because it is in many ways harder to write shorter than it is to write longer. Because you must make your points so much faster and they have to make sense. Like I don't come from that tradition. I come from writing the long, broadsheet pieces.
The headlines of the Post are nothing if not made for the internet.
That's for
Like,
sure.
they're amazing,
yeah.
right? Like, they
but
are-
they've been for years like that.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But you can state a position, but can you do much to support it, to reason through it?
I don't think Twitter's very good for that. I'll be quite honest with you. Twitter is very good at just getting people's views and linking you to articles that you agree with.
I do want to get back to that point about news leaking too, because you brought that up, Sal. And Daniel Boorstin, in his classic work, The Image, talked about, and you also used Boorstin's term, pseudo-event to refer to it. And the thing about the news leak is that it's not a real event. Nothing actually happened, and the question is, what does it mean?
Right.
So we also have all this use of language now coming out there, and we're not sure what it means. What is going on? I mean, again, the classic General Semantics question: what is going on? It's almost designed to leave that unanswered and, in fact, frustrate any attempt to answer that question.
Well, the pseudo-event, or the news leak, or an interview, it does have an ambiguous relationship to reality. I mean, you don't know. I mean, a basic pseudo-event would be Madonna appearing on Letterman, right? That's a classic pseudo-event. Or an interview in the Post, right? It's a classic interview. It's a classic pseudo-event. It's meant for publicity purposes. It's meant for visibility purposes. It's meant to create buzz. When Madonna is speaking to Letterman and they're flirting with each other, how real is that? It's a performance. So one of the problems of the news leak and the problem of the pseudo-event is this ambiguity.
And McLuhan called it government by news leak.
Right, and because that's how they'll know. Well, now McLuhan's writing that in the '60s. There's a little bit more analysis since then. I'm not consulting, Marshall, but there are other ways now. I mean, they use the news leak just in order to, just like they did in the advertising, Mad Men era of advertising. They throw something out there to see how it plays, and if it plays well, then they'll go with it. They do that with appointments. When Bush appointed his personal lawyer to the Supreme Court, Harriet Miers, a woman who had no litigation experience. He did that, of course, to buy time, but that was met with immediate disdain, even from members of his own party. And so that gave him, about a month or so to find somebody he was comfortable with.
Isabelle, you were going to...
Newsleak, you mean like stuff that's published as, that's published as a news leak that's from a source that's not identified?
Could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I get news leaked all the time in like New York City politics.
Sure.
And I'm always conscious of who is trying to use me now. And so there's a whole, for me anyway, there's a whole series of questions that I ask, and I have to somehow verify that leak. Like it could be true, but I have to do my own due diligence. But it's amazing. I mean, and just on this like very micro level, because I don't cover national politics, but I do cover a lot of corruption in New York City. So I'm always wondering, why is this person coming to me, and what do they want me to do? And is this something that is verifiable, or is it? I mean, I'm not going to publish somebody's opinion, but you're talking more on like a national level where.
Well, no, you see, reporters like you sort of thwart those folks, right? People who have, honorable work ethic tend to thwart those people, right? Because the journalistic field, let's put it that way, is a site in which players, right, political actors, want to control the news narrative, so they will use whatever they can get. What's happened with the internet and with some of those television shows on Facebook is that people have created their own news leaks simply with the flood of opinion. Alex Jones and that what was that called? InfoWars or something? That, this guy? Yeah, he will just simply say things. Obama is a secret Muslim or something like that, right? And that will get picked up. Not by you,
Yeah,
of
no,
course.
no, but-
Not by you, but by, unscrupulous platforms.
There's actually been like interesting research that kind of shows the filtering through and changing and diluting isn't the right word, but watering down of some of the stuff like that, kind of how it filters through ecosystems on both the right and the left, and kind of where those publishing ecosystems look like.
But it was to your point about, what's a lie, like, and how do you verify it? And this happened to me as a very young journalist, covering on the eve of another impeachment that nobody remembers, but it was the impeachment of the president of Brazil in 1993. So before that, there were these, sorry it's long-winded, but there were these two Canadians who were involved in a kidnapping of a supermarket magnate in Sao Paulo. And this was he was a very wealthy guy. They were holding him for $30 million. The police captured them, and they were the first two to come out of the safe house where they were holding this guy. But the Canadians, the mother of one of the Canadians hired a publicist in Canada, and all of a sudden the narrative completely changed. Like, oh, they were human rights workers, they were, traveling on false passports, they didn't know what they were doing. And, and I had to cover this, and I thought when I went to cover it that they were in fact innocent, but not realizing how big this public relations campaign was. But then when I did look at it, I realized, how subjective truth is depending on who you're talking to. The real story that I found was that they were working for the FMLN in El Salvador, and this was like a big political kidnapping. But I had to struggle with, okay, were they freedom fighters? Were they terrorists? Were they kidnappers? Was this? I don't know if I'm making my point, but it was like, truth is very subjective.
And yet the truth is out there, isn't it?
I guess, yeah.
You have, as a reporter, though, you have to.
But that's what, it's funny because, people, when I started at the Post, there were 4 of us in the investigative unit, like so-called. And we each were talking about why we were there. And I kind of stupidly said, well, I want to find out the truth. That's why I'm a reporter. And everybody laughed at me. They're like, are you kidding? So I'm just like,
You're Canadians. You're a good
no,
person.
I'm like, yes. But no, I still believe that. I really truly believe that, and that's why I don't, I figured out when people are trying to run stuff by me, and even the opposition research people who call, I check their research. It's bad most of the time. like the public like they're supposedly basing it on tax liens and public documents, and they're reading everything wrong. So anyway, sorry to.
So there are such things as facts.
I think so.
And
Yeah.
you're reporting on
I
the
have to
facts.
believe that.
I was just going to add to that oppositional research is like one of the biggest industries in political organizations.
I want to, actually, since we have Isabelle here, find the recent Atlantic article about investigation. I don't know if you saw it.
I didn't see it. Sorry.
But it actually is about the word investigation. What does it mean to investigate? And that the word has changed. Where it used to mean to get at the facts and to find out, and now it means, it carries with it the assumption of guilt, and it is simply to prove, to support the accusation of guilt. So when say Trump calls for investigating Biden, it's not to find out one way or another, but it is simply to provide support for the claims that he's guilty in something. So have you run into any of this sort of shift in meaning?
I don't like.
Since that's how you define yourself.
Well, I was just going to say that I don't like that definition. A reporter, by the very essence of what a reporter does, is investigation. You shouldn't have to have a qualifier like that. And I sort of rail against it, but at the same time, I'm guilty of having to put myself in a different category, say from a political reporter or somebody who's just covering, you know, the news or rewriting the news. There's so much rewriting of the news now. I mean, look at the Daily Mail. But it's the most successful, correct me if I'm wrong, Jessie, but like they're the most successful, they are,
I don't know.
online publication. Like they get the greatest number of hits, but yeah, so what is investigation now?
Well, do you find that people are using it in ways that that you consider to be
I mean,
wrong? Or?
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I think I'm using it wrong. I think I shouldn't have to call myself an investigative reporter. You know, you're probably right about what you say, that the word is so loaded with, oh, it's guilty before, you know, the presumption of innocence.
Well, at an institutional level, say Congress, right? Congress has subpoena powers, and it has committees that part of their identity is to investigate, right? And that's a propaganda tool. I mean, what they did, the Benghazi investigation, they knew there was nothing there, but they used the powers of subpoena, they used the power of investigation, they used the press to put Clinton on the stand for 11 hours.
But didn't Roy Cohen invent that, Sal?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, that goes, that.
And what does the panel feel about Roy Cohen in General Semantics terms?
Probably one of the worst human beings in the United States, ever. You know, he ruined a lot of lives, that's for sure. I don't know if everybody knows who wrote Roy Cohen.
Where's my Roy?
Most people don't.
Is he related to Stephen?
Roy Cohen, but he was the attorney to Joe McCarthy, and he was McCarthy's advisor. McCarthy had a problem. He had a medical condition. It was called alcoholism, and but Roy Cohen was his diligent sidekick and really made those investigations work.
He was also Trump's mentor.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I want to go back then to, I mean, what other words do you find problematic, you know, that are coming up?
Tabloid.
Tabloid.
Okay. Tabloid is a size of newspaper. There's a
Right.
broadsheet, there's a tabloid. And it kills me every time I read in the New York Times especially, when they're covering a story and they say the tabloidization of something. I mean, look around. It's a tabloid world. It always has been, I think. But look at all of the stories. I mean, the New Yorker wins a Pulitzer for what? You know, a tabloid story about Harvey Weinstein. You know, and I'm using tabloid now in the sort of popular, sensationalistic interpretation of that. But it's like, so we will do a story. I will give you personal examples. I will work on a story for a couple of years, like, you know, incrementally. I did a story about Congressman Gregory Meeks in Queens, about all the corruption surrounding him, and his, you know, his benefactors and the loans he got, the interest-free loans. The New York Times has ignored this story for 2 years that we've been diligently reporting on it, every little aspect. But then they come out with an analysis on the front page of this, you know, what they have termed a tabloid story. So the way they get around that sensationalism is to turn it into an analysis piece in which they'll completely rip off our stuff. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but I've been a victim of it, and I've called the Metro editor of the Times and said, you know, you can't do this. And they just screamed at me.
Well,
But I don't care.
Well,
you know?
even without the analysis, like both the Times and the Washington Post the past couple months have gotten in at least a lot of journalists mad at them, and at least people kind of in that world mad at them for doing like exactly that, even without the like pretending it's an analysis or just like kind of in the reprinting the news kind of fashion. Right. Somebody from Slate, who I know was just April Glazer, kind of was just talking about this today, right? And just today, the Times added a correction to like add her original reporting for that.
Yeah, the Times will do that. They're shameless. They will rip off, they will take the story from you guys, or they'll take the story from the Inquirer, and they will present it they'll package it in such a way to make them appear to be above the fray. You know, I mean, they're in the same business you're in, obviously, right? So, but you have to keep in mind, tabloidization was meant about 25 years or so ago as a term used to suggest that public discourse or news stories, soft news, whatever you want to call it, was more engaged in personal stories as opposed to issues. And I think it was a problematic term even then, right? But that's where it essentially.
Yeah, but I just like, we were talking about the use of words.
Mhm.
And when they say a tabloid style story, I
Right.
mean, like, get over yourselves. Like, the whole world is a tabloid story right now. You know, like, between everything that's
Stereotype.
going on at NBC with, you know, Harvey Weinstein, Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, where is she?
Jason Epstein.
No, it's Jeffrey.
Oh,
Guy who
okay.
committed
Right.
suicide. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like they're all on my level now, having to report on it.
But your point about tabloid was
Yeah.
also that it goes back, I mean, the Daily News was New York's picture newspaper.
Yeah.
And that was the stigma that tabloids emphasized photographs.
Yeah, and
you
it's
know,
still very important.
and serious newspapers emphasized writing. I remember being at a conference discussion about journalism. I think it was in the 90s, and the fellow, a very, very respected scholar of media, said that no newspaper that wants to be taken seriously will ever publish color photographs. I hear rumors that the New York Times does this
Right.
now.
Even the journal, right? Yeah.
What other words, though? I'd like to just.
It's
you know-
not so much individual words.
Well, I want individual words.
But it's the context of those words.
But what words? I mean, Postman had a great little pun on this demeaning of meaning. You know, meanings demeaning by the way that we change the meaning of words
Well,
or
I'll give you
drain
one.
their meaning. I mean, he also called it the great symbol drain. So.
Right, I'll give you one.
Yeah.
I will take the word impeach. I mean,
Okay.
it's not an F word, it's not the N word, it's not the
It's an
C,
I word.
you know, I mean, we can
Oh,
go
right.
through that. But when you say to the press, and the press dutifully reports it, I want to impeach Eric Swalwell, or I want to impeach Adam Schiff, or I think Nancy Pelosi should be impeached. That's the degradation of the word.
Yeah.
In a sense, I mean, it's not pornographic, right? But it is degradation in that
Yeah.
sense.
Well, even in like that word, the way that people use it most of the time, I guess. I don't know if I would say most or much of the time, but is also like not to talk about the process, which is about a process, right? Like
Right.
it means to, like, people mean removed from office, right? And that's not what it means, right? So I got to, on my dog walking group, like as a resident political scientist, be like, here's what the impeachment process actually looks like, and like it does not actually mean that they will like vote the guy out in like a couple weeks or whatever, right? But like it is like a long and drawn out bureaucratic legal process, right? Like.
This is one of the things I think we can learn from Trump. He understands, I think, the media environment better than perhaps most of us do. That he understands that it's the optics that matter, not so much what the process actually is.
But also, going back to Nixon, and you know, I mean, when Nixon was under impeachment inquiry, you'd have to be 106 years old to have been alive when Andrew Johnson was around. So, I mean, people didn't have any idea what impeachment, and I forget who it was, but I think you probably know the anecdote that a pollster asked, should Nixon be impeached? And the answer, most people said no. And it happened to have been a pollster who also did work for Nixon. So another pollster said, wait a minute, people don't know what impeach means. So they did the same poll, but they said, should Nixon be investigated and put on trial in front of the Senate to determine his guilt or innocence in the Watergate matter? And the majority of people said yes. So, it was the meaning of impeach. I also, J.R.R. Tolkien from, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, he believed that the sound of words had meaning, and you think about imp, right? And the words that start that way, improper, imprudent, impotent, implausible. I mean, it's just amazing all the negative feeling that comes with words that start with I-M-P. So
How about imperial?
Huh?
Imperial.
Imperial, right? It's just fascinating to look at that.
One other point, I mean, but the whole issue of polling, like with the last election and with all the stuff that's gone on with these polls about, there was a Fox News poll recently that said that the majority of people wanted to impeach Trump, but then there was a problem with that poll.
So people were like, oh, it's Fox News. Even the Fox News poll shows that they want to impeach Trump, which means it must be true. But that's not. They actually have a legitimate polling apparatus, just the same as any other political poll we might pay attention to, right? But so going back to the idea that you might be captured too, right? And this is in that case, it's not the case.
But does now that happen? The polls have been so wrong in the past, or have they been right?
I was a small pitch for recent polling. Polling is super hard. Polling is only getting harder, obviously. But so the 2016 polls were off in the wrong direction, right? Obviously. But they were actually pretty close to being correct, numerically. Right? So polling is about probability. Polling is actually not about directionality. This person will win, and this, that's obviously the way we read it and interpret it, but it's about probability and it's about percentages. And the polling data was actually not that far off. It was just slightly off in the wrong direction. So to give a counter or a similar example, the Obama polling data in 2012, or now I'm mixing up my years, but basically, in 2012, yeah, and then but the amount between those years in 2008 also was basically the same, and I'm forgetting which year was actually closest to the 2016 one now, forgive me, but was the percentages of what people thought the polls said were exactly or very close to the same amount off, right? Just because it was that slightly wrong direction, we read them as radically wrong, but the actual numbers that they said it was going, what the turnout was going to be was the same amount wrong functionally, but it seems so much different if you can't
Well, 2012 was when Obama thought he was going to lose.
Well, only.
From the exit polls.
Yeah, the internals didn't though. I'm talking about internals, the kind of all the data-driven stuff. But the way that the way that the public understands polling and data is also really not great.
The poll is the perfect propaganda vehicle.
Yeah,
I can read the poll any way I want. Now, don't be offended by this, but polls are basically used by lazy journalists, because they can build a story around these numbers that may or may not exist. That, if they go to probability or directionality, that is never explained by Lawrence O'Donnell.
Yeah.
That's never explained by the person who says 51% said that Trump should be impeached. What does that actually mean?
Well, we'll take questions in a little bit, just. But let's just. Okay. I'm sorry.
There was also this discussion of how pollsters as they got more data, especially starting in 2006 ish started to give like 2 percentages like after the digit. So like this person has like 33.72%, right? And that connotes like this like clarity, right?
It's a range of difference, right?
It's a range of difference, but if I say you have 35% versus you have 35.05%, you think I'm more right with the decimal
Yes.
points,
Right,
right?
right, right.
And so there has actually been this
Right,
move in
right,
journalism to
right.
to take the decimal points back because it was giving this like perception of clarity and precision that is like antithetical to polling itself, kind of.
Let me just tell a short anecdote. A group of students, I had a group of graduate students about 5 years ago. What they did is, about 3 of them, they opened up an information agency. They took polls from other people, repackaged them, and sold them to politicians, to businessmen, to individuals. And they were making money at this. What did they do? They packaged the BS from various polling operations, repackaged it, put a narrative around it, and sold it. And people were, because we believe that because it's a number, it's got to be real.
Yeah. By the way, polls silly,
Yes.
because nothing has happened.
Right.
You know, nothing in the world has happened, and ultimately, none of them are verifiable.
Right.
Except by other polls, and you know, as they say, the only poll that matters is the voting,
Right.
the actual voting.
Well, exit polls matter, though that's the closest you would get to an accurate poll.
Well,
That's
they,
not empirically true. It's not.
Well, it depends on people lie, is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
yeah. But traditionally it hasn't been.
Right.
and they only matter in terms of affecting people who haven't voted yet.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
Which you know, has been an issue in the past, but well, I guess Jesse, do you have a word that you
I
thought?
didn't.
Oh,
I was
okay.
hoping we would focus on
You don't
these
have to.
words.
I don't want to force it.
I don't have a great word.
Okay, I want to throw one out just
Okay.
because it's been bugging me for a couple of years now. Double down. Right, journalists on TV use this term all the time. He doubled down on his claim, and it's a gambling term. It's a gambling metaphor to double down. You know, it's I think for blackjack primarily, and you know, it just seems to me too much of a coincidence that the term has come into common use in journalism along with Trump's appearance, you know, Trump being, of course, a casino guy, among other things. I mean, it does reinforce the idea of elections, of politics as a game and as gambling.
I'll give you a word. I think the word deal has become a kind of, instead of a treaty you're having with a country, right? His sons go to maybe Brazil, and they say, let's make a deal.
Yeah.
And so it's or Saudi Arabia, right? They want to make a deal. So it's not a treaty, it's not a contract.
Right.
It's it sounds like it's the raising business or business practices to a level that I don't think it deserves.
And we're left guessing what's behind door number 3. Well, I think we can open up to questions now. Tom, you wanted to ask one, or?
I was going to make a comment. When people were talking about Poland, we decided to deal a couple of times. I don't know if you wrote this, but I remember you saying it. That,
Could you talk a little louder?
yeah, Neil Postman, I remember him saying that, you know, when he reads a poll that says 73% of Americans believe this or that, he sort of knee-jerk would go the other way, thinking that 73% of Americans don't think particularly deeply about anything.
Except it's too sad.
And a good one.
I mean, but and even right now, there are concerns about like even tracking impeachment preference, right, or kind of what you think should be done is actually now just tracking approval levels, right? So like a similar oh, we don't really know, maybe we don't know what this word means, maybe I do know what this word means, but I don't really care, right? And I'm gonna say this other thing that I have in my head.
Okay. Jacob, you?
Yeah, my question has to do with the word impeach. It kind of reminds me of how when somebody like Bill Cosby or Louis C.K. does something that general culture deems unsavory, that on Twitter it's called canceling them. It's called cancel culture, that we're just going to cancel them, undo all of the media contracts that they've been signed for. For Don Sterling a few years ago, he says an offensive word and all of a sudden he's fired. I feel like impeach is used in the same way that we're just trying to cancel them. It doesn't really matter the political process, it's the idea we don't like them. Reminds me of the Soviet Union where they made people disappear.
Right.
Literally, they would erase them from photos. And that also reminds me of how in the New York Times, for instance, there was a story, I think 2 weeks ago, about a girl who got her dreadlocks cut off by
Yes.
kids in her class, and then I think 2 days later they published some redaction saying, oh wait, that story was totally false. So I think that it goes both ways, that both for liberal and conservative leaning stories, or stories that have implications for conservative or liberal views, there's publications that are very trigger happy to publish a story that seems to validate their side of the story, and then they published it so fast that once they fact checked it, they realized, oh wait, this actually didn't happen.
Yeah, you know, Yochai Benkler, he runs this Harvard Center for Internet something, writes this book, Network Propaganda, right, in which he talks about how Ukrainian or Georgian, Russian area, or Russian Internet operatives create, items, artifacts, whether on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, in order to sow resentment and to sow hostility among races, among generations. And part of it I've seen this on Twitter, where they'll have a video, a remarkably well-produced video of a woman going up to a black guy and making an absolutely untenable word, right? Using the N-word or something to that effect. And those videos get, go viral. And what does that do? Where do they come from? Then you'll see it the other way, right? They used to be where, especially in New York, and your newspaper was responsible, there were stories that were in the Daily News or the Post that said black kids were going to malls and beating up old people. So there's I don't know where this comes from, but apparently, the internet has spawned, a variety of these genres.
Same thing talking about very, I don't want to say clickbait headlines, right, but like very clickable news, right,
Yeah.
that you are often not fact checked, right?
Right.
Just in order to get that. I think that's kind of different than like the idea of being canceled too, just to kind of separate those two things out, right? Because in many of these cases of canceling, like Louis C.K. gets a different TV show later on, right? Like, so you're canceled in a way that doesn't necessarily hold after time and things like this too, right? And I think kind of the presumption of the ramifications of kind of an immediate kind of getting in trouble, right, on the internet. Our short attention spans don't account for the ways that those people are often come back up kind of rather unharmed, right? And that I think those are two separate things, and I am kind of deeply skeptical of the latter, of the canceling kind of as like a grave trauma of our modern times.
I would point out, the metaphor of cancel is, of course, a media metaphor, right? So, sort of like you're fired, you're canceled.
Yeah.
When I went to go to erase something on the board and I say I want to delete that.
Yes.
So it's a slang.
Yeah.
I was just curious, whether you like Trump or you don't like him. I think that most people, who may like him, agree that he's coarse. It's just to take the lack of another word. He's a coarse individual. He's not refined. What caused him to be elected? Why did so many people come out to vote for him? I mean, whether you liked Hillary Clinton or didn't, she wasn't as coarse, quote, as him. They politics. Millions of people, and they knew him a little bit, the way he spoke and acted prior to him running. What caused so many people to bring him to the front?
How about the word authenticity?
What?
That's just a word I don't want my students to use. I should have picked that word.
Why not?
Yeah, why not?
Because the idea of like who gets to be authentic, right? How can we all do the same actions and if we were in a mediated experience, you don't know any of us, so you don't really know if they're authentic, but who gets to kind of seem authentic, right? Tends to affect some people a lot more than others about getting to seem authentic, and basically it's a proxy for perhaps likable, which is a proxy for people who we are like already, right? Monopoly. But I think the way that kind of social media promotes it, but also like promotes a certain type of it, right? That only some people are set up well, are kind of likely to be able to enact authenticity through Twitter or through Instagram in a particular way, right? Like
a more authentic looking person.
Yeah, right. But if we were on Instagram, right? If this panel was on Instagram, I would probably have a better shot at being authentic than the rest of the panel by virtue of my age, right? And I know, right? Exactly, right? But like to think about like how obviously that. Oh, because I'm a young person and like I look like I fit in that space.
Oh,
But you're not Jennifer
You need
Aniston.
people
No, yeah.
who use
Who broke
Instagram.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
would be more authentic to people who use it.
That's right. And she-
Yeah, and so
Okay.
to do
That's
that,
different than saying I'm more
authenticity
authentic.
is open to certain actors more
Right.
than to others, right? And I think that we want it. We feel like we want it through social media channels, and then still it is limited.
I guess if I was wearing a tweed jacket.
Your question about Trump, I'd like to take a little bit of a crack at it. I mean, he appealed to certain fears, and he used the same propaganda and rhetorical style that Adolf Hitler used. I can get your jobs. Well, people are afraid. The immigrants are going to take your jobs. Only I can do it. He's authoritarian, and if people were raised in authoritarian cultures without much, yeah, well, they
no,
exist.
keep in mind, it was a tribal kind of an election, right?
Yeah.
Republicans are not going to vote for a Democrat, and Democrats, by and large, don't vote for Republicans, although there are Democrats who do that, right? So, but keep in mind, he lost the popular vote. The structure of the governmental process is a lot more complicated than we think. Urban areas are penalized because we have people. California has 40 million people and 2 senators. Wyoming has less than 1 million people, 750,000 people. They have 2 senators.
But that's why we have the Senate and the House, because the House.
Yes,
is on-
right.
so that
But
balances out.
the Senate is the more powerful body, and the Senate is a more conservative body. I don't mean conservative politically. They just put a check on the House. That's what I.
the way our government is set up.
Yeah. So in a sense, right? Geographically, Trump controls a lot of land, but not a lot of people. There's a disconnect. So he won through the gamesmanship of the system. He knew how to game the system, but he's not the only one. I mean, Clinton knew how to do it in '92. He won that election by, but he had an appeal to the South because he was from Arkansas.
So therefore it evens out to say.
Pardon me?
Therefore it evens out. Trump being a Republican won this time, Clinton being a Democrat won the last, so it evens out.
No. The last, no, it doesn't even out. I'll tell you why. I mean, Republicans haven't won the popular vote only once in the last 4 elections. In 2004, I think he won the popular vote. They lost the popular vote in 2000, and in 2016. That's, I mean, so in a sense, they're a minority party that knows how to win elections.
Okay,
Okay.
all right.
Well,
You had a question?
Social media, there's a very interesting thing, and I don't do social media, but today I stumbled upon something where Donald Trump Jr. made comments about Hunter Biden's nepotism, or the Biden nepotism. So this speaks to, I think, the cluelessness of so many people who make decisions about political whatever based on the social media before their eyes.
Well, that's
I know, and I had a conversation 10 days ago with somebody who is an avid Trump supporter, lives in New York, and I said to him, would you trust your money to a man who has gone bankrupt 3 times, whose casinos failed, who failed to succeed with the most iconic property in New York, which was the Plaza Hotel in the early 90s, and his airline failed, and his this failed, and that failed, and he said yes, that he would trust Donald Trump. I don't personally get it.
But that's because he
Well,
hates
you don't have
people
to
like
do it,
you and me more than he likes Trump.
Yeah.
In other words, it's the tribalization of American political culture.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter, right?
it's
That's his
totally
tribe.
irrational.
Right, yeah, of course.
Oh,
yeah.
that's right.
But the vote
I
is
know
irrational.
other people who are equally
There's a lot to
as
be said.
irrational as this individual that I
Right.
spoke to 2 weeks ago.
And the fascinating thing about some of the stuff about national acting and like people vote in this like partisan way, regardless of if they agree with any or most of the policy positions that a candidate holds, if they align party-wise, right? They do. The kind of way that this hits with the money part is also like if you ask people kind of like what are factual statements, right, and they'll get a certain amount wrong because they believe in partisan kind of ideology. If you ask them if you pay them a small amount of money, this is like one of my favorite experimental designs. You pay them a very small amount of money, they will get markedly better at telling you what the factually correct answer is, right? So like the idea that this person would actually invest their money is actually probably not true, but they will certainly say that and perhaps even do an important thing that we think is really important, like vote, right, that way. But like you can incentivize people to be super rational under certain circumstances that are not like our regular political process, right? Which perhaps doesn't speak particularly well of how we deal with politics in this country.
Well,
yeah. but
Well, it's a difference between a symbolic action and
Yeah.
one that has,
Right.
Yeah.
is actually has concrete value.
There used to be among political scientists the idea that there was something called a rational voter.
Yeah.
And that was basically an ideal. I don't think that ever existed. There is aspirational voting. There are people. People vote their aspirations, right? And they vote their hatreds, and they vote their, you can, and in instances they vote their economic interests.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Joe Walsh of the Eagles said it best when he said, as much as things change, they don't just sort of stay the same.
Right.
And I mean, Alexander Hamilton was brought up at the beginning. Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson had it out using the media, right? If you look at Lincoln, the politician that spoke before Lincoln at Gettysburg Address spoke for 3 hours. Lincoln spoke for the time frame that he did because it could fit into a telegraph, and the message got sent out to the media across the country, and he was in a very bad way. And it turned his presidency around by the telegraph. And today we have social media, which addresses Jesse's aspect up there, where I think, my point earlier regarding the monetization of the media, it's always been there. It's always been a tool for salesmen to use. You have Wilson, whose health was completely ill in the Treaty of Versailles, which has long-lasting effects. His wife basically ran the country at the end of his presidency, and they didn't tell him about it. I mean, talk about what is the definition of being presidential? What if Melania were running things and Trump were in bed? Secondarily, how about FDR? His son held him up at the podium to hide his illness. Is that what we would like? So I don't know what the definition of presidential is, and maybe the voter, the normal voter, or whatever it is, maybe we just have to realize we're all subject to sales. The media and the semantics of it all is sales. The Obama administration, they captured the use of social media and used it for 2 elections. Am I wrong in that capacity? Trump, how did he get elected? He used social media, the modern equivalent of Telegraph, of which Lincoln used in his day. Now, people might not like the message, and I'm not saying I did, but the semantics of how we work today and how we're sold stuff has to do with metadata. Has to do with, you were saying earlier, the paparazzi are out. Why? Because the cell phones. We're recording this right now. It could be posted, hashtag, Twitter, Instagram, whatever you want to say. And then you have the modern, the legacy media, which Isabelle is a part of. It hasn't it all changed, but it all just stays the same. It's just amped up. It's faster, and we as consumers are buying into this crap left or right. I didn't say BS. But, am I wrong in that it hasn't changed since Alexander Hamilton's day at the beginning of the Republic, when a bunch of wealthy guys convinced a bunch of poor people, the rest of the country, to start a revolution against people who were taxing the wealthy people a little too much?
I think the question is not how hasn't it changed, but when and how, because I agree, like we see similar patterns. The question for me becomes, when does size or scale qualitatively change things too, even if kind of there are similar practices? When does scale of operations or speed of operations?
But constitutionally, at the beginning of this country, unless you owned property,
Oh yeah.
you were not allowed to vote.
Yeah.
White, black, or otherwise.
Yeah.
Unless you owned property. So it's a smaller population.
I'm not
no
a
doubt.
nostalgic.
We have 350 million people you got to get the message out to, and yeah, there's an electoral college, and our system is set up that it is John.
But your very point is actually that how much things have changed.
Have they or have they not? I don't
Well,
think
you just pointed to it with all the examples. An example like Roosevelt, where folks didn't know that he was in a wheelchair, or our friend Joshua Meyerowitz in his book No Sense of Place makes this point. Grover Cleveland at the end of the 19th century, while president, had part of his jaw removed in an operation on the 4th of July, cancer operation, and no one knew about it then, and they didn't know about it for decades, until decades later. Now, no one can do that today, right? The environment has changed drastically. And so that's one thing, and that is of course what really undid a lot of Clinton's presidency, as we talked about earlier, is that he did something that presidents before him had done in various ways, but it was no longer possible to keep that a secret, or very difficult to. But the other side of it is that what Trump is doing when we talk about being presidential is not just that stuff is coming out. This is a flood of stuff. Stormy Daniels, right? And
JFK, he didn't do the same thing.
Exactly, but the point is we never heard about it.
Right,
we
so-
didn't know about how his very poor
So
health.
what's better? Is that censorship in the past, or is it censorship now?
But-
Lack of.
But the difference then is it's not the transparency that we're talking about, though. It's on the other side, the fact that he is willing to act in the way that he does, which is to, as we talk about the coarseness of it, the willingness to talk about, to talk in a way to refer to people he doesn't like as traitors, and to use these words. Treason doesn't mean anything anymore. He uses the word impeach, right? That was the thing, right? I impeach you, right? All of these kind of gestures and ways of talking that go beyond any kind of just, okay, he cursed in private like Nixon did.
Okay, I have
Right.
a follow-up question. Colin Powell has come out speaking about Trump as being the way he is, exactly what you're saying, right?
What do you mean exactly what I'm?
He's
Like
condemning
that.
Trump and his semantics of his language, et cetera. Okay?
Yeah.
Colin Powell got in front of the United Nations and was brought up before and said that there were weapons of mass destruction as an emissary of W's administration when they're warned. Okay, I prefer not to be, lied to. So I have a problem with a guy who today, Colin Powell, who has admitted on his own that there was no yellow cake uranium in Africa. It was kind of like he just made it up, and a lot of my friends died in action as a result of that. As a generation of service people. So would you prefer someone fully chained, or would you prefer them to lie?
But we're being lied to anyway. That's.
Colin Powell was lied to.
The authentic question came up. He's not hiding who he is.
Go ahead, yes.
Let me address your
So that
earlier
means
point.
more than
To-
just-
and
I get annoyed when I'm lied to.
I take her point that certain parts of the media environment are similar, right? But certain things have changed, and that's because the media environment has changed. Neil uses a great metaphor in his book, The Disappearance of Childhood, when he says that what television did is bring everything out of the closet. And we've had a qualitative change. One of the reasons why we didn't know about JFK's indiscretions or Roosevelt's illness. People did know about Roosevelt's illness. They knew.
They
He
did.
had both. They did. I asked my parents. They did. It wasn't spoken about because it was seen as unseemly. It was seen as something that today, unless it's unseemly, it's going to be in the public sphere. Because the media environment since television and the internet just simply amplifies all that stuff, has made unseemly common.
Transparency
That's not
has
the
made things
same.
extremely transparent.
Yeah,
And now we're seeing the personal lifestyle of somebody in the office
right.
who happens to be whatever type of a guy you want to call him.
A pig.
A pig? Okay. I would suggest that a pig were in the 90s performing a young lady who's an intern. I mean, if that came out at the time that it did, I think that's disgusting. If I were working in a corporate office, which I'll leave names aside, and I cornered a young intern, I'd be fired and shamed out of the industry that I'm in. That's a fact. So I look at the historical left or right. We're just in a transparent environment because of, again, the social media, the lack of the paparazzi being able to be paid for this stuff, because everybody's seeing it. It's out there. It's a cultural change.
But the ultimate, I'm not saying you're saying anything wrong. What I'm saying is that we have a coarseness in the culture that basically offends a lot of people. Now, what happens when the coarseness reaches the mass level, and there's been studies on this, that people opt out of the political experience. They don't want to be part. They don't want to be part of a campaign, or they don't want to be part of a political party that engages in such negativity, and so they opt out. In other words, what I'm saying is that in campaigns, for example, let's just use that as a case study. When campaigns get extremely negative, mudslinging on both sides, people opt out. And so if I have a lot of money from the Koch brothers, say, and I can throw as much mud against my opponent as he can, and in fact more, then I have a better chance of winning. That's where the political
I think
reality
people
is.
are afraid to express their opinion, is what you're seeing as opt out.
That could be.
I
That
think
could be
that
because
they're demonized and they go, you know what, I'm gonna go to this party, I'm gonna keep my mouth shut because if I say something, I'm gonna be condemned, I'll be viewed
I mean, but
as
that's
Satan.
also not particularly.
So they're opting out.
My grandson,
Like,
when
we all, yeah.
Political views, there's discussion with his classmates, he's in college, was in college at the time. He's no grandma, he becomes an argument. They don't talk, they
This is a
yell.
nice civil
He
discourse.
just, I'd rather not say anything.
Yeah.
And that's what you're saying, he's
And
opting
it's
out.
because of transparency. People, what do you think? It's respecting each other's opinions about what you think, and
Right.
you respect people as an individual. If on the upper level, as far as salesmanship goes, yes, but it's always been that bad. People have been lying to us since the beginning of the republic. That's what we're trying to process. That. We've been lied to. breaking news.
The problem here is that you're talking about transparency, but now we have being transparent about lying. Right, we've gone to a meta level, and so, I'm authentic because I'm clear that I'm lying. It's sort of the Joey Suzu, for those of you who are old enough to remember, politics. And that comes across as authenticity. I'm just going to say whatever I think.
I think for a politician, that's what's qualitatively different about Trump versus everyone and anyone who came before him.
Right.
Is that everyone else tried to have a facade.
Well, I mean, look, everybody puts on the word person, just one second. The word person comes from persona, which means mask. We are all putting on a mask, right? So even Trump's belligerence and authenticity is a mask. We're in a social situation. I'm playing a particular role, right? So it's not something I think that's problematic. The thing to do is to sort of try to understand the context of the situation, right?
And it's sort of an irony here because he's the least transparent president we've had, in the sense of no tax returns, no revealing about his contacts with others. I mean, that's.
But I think that Obama was not such a transparent president.
Right.
I mean, I know from the FOIAs, from the Freedom of Information requests, that it was just like a wall there.
Right.
I mean, and if you recall, one of the first things he did in 2008, which I found really offensive, is he didn't allow the press corps into the White House. Like, he didn't allow the press corps photographers. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Like, he handed out the pictures. I'm like, really?
Right.
That's not American.
Look, what would you do? You're the president of the United States. I want to control the narrative. Trump likes to control his own narrative. So did Obama. Now, I mean, if it was good enough for Reagan, if it was good enough for Bush, why isn't it good enough for Obama?
For Lincoln.
Oh, Lincoln, thank you.
But this is where the conversation about authenticity becomes kind of important too,
Well,
because it acts as
right.
a stand-in for actual transparency, right? If I post a picture of hugging on Twitter, then that seems authentic and can laminate to an idea about transparency that is may or may not be there, right? And so that it can kind of do double duty in a lot of these cases too. This speaks to kind of the double standard.
Well, here we are at Players, and it's called acting. And Trump, and all this, I'll say it, bullshit about him being a businessman. Primarily for close to 2 decades, he's been a television actor, a television personality. Yeah.
Something that I had discussed with Keith was what I call the John Wayne syndrome, the feel good, you're fired.
Yeah.
This is an emotion that feels very good to a lot of people who vote for Trump.
Yeah.
Right. And
That's why they voted for
Well,
it.
that's just they say Mark Burnett.
And you're
being
fired
Trump, right?
is
Mark
not,
Burnett
is a
was the
sentiment.
producer who created
It's not a
The
policy.
Apprentice. Yeah.
sometimes people vote against someone, and that's why
That's
they
true.
did that with
Well,
so.
do we have any other questions? Because you're kind of running.
How about a
short.
standing ovation?
Wait.
Is there more questions?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little late in the game, but I wanted to throw out a few words. And one is conservative, and the other is liberal. I know, the trope of the liberal media, and especially, to the great effect of liberal news media, right? We all sort of know where that one is right now, but I think, George Will and Bill Bristol have a problem with what is, currently considered and called conservative.
Well, also the word socialism in this country, just like all the things that people consider socialist here. Like, I'm from Canada, it's kind of everything's normal. I'm not saying it works well, but why is, healthcare and not paying a lot for school like a socialist proposition here?
Propaganda is very powerful in this country, and if we don't recognize the power of propaganda, then that's one of the reasons. That
Because-
word was taken, the concept was taken over in the 50s and
But none of
denigrated.
these Democratic candidates will use that word. Like I noticed, I'm like.
Except for Bernie.
Well, and he was the most authentic,
Yeah.
I thought, in the debate
Yeah.
yesterday. Like,
Which has been his
Oh, sorry,
advantage.
authentic, no.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
that's-
yeah. But what do you, like, there's the kind of the thing that you're trying to get to is maybe that you.
Like, there was
think he
no
believes in
BS
what he's
from
gonna
him. There
say.
was no sophistry in what he said. I'm not saying I'm supporting anybody here, but
See,
it was
I
very
see.
interesting.
I saw him as being nothing but sophistry.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that,
Very interesting.
I think that sometimes
Follow
people
his
mix
career.
up
So-
the word authentic with integrity. And that's a different level of behavior. You might come across on media as an authentic person because of your persona, but do you have what we would label integrity based on fact, based on history, based on behavior, based on civilized discourse, or whatever you want to call integrity? It might be honesty, but I think that the word authentic has taken on a meaning that is being confused with integrity, or people are saying he's authentic, but they're not saying has integrity.
I think that's a great point, and the idea of honesty. When you think about politics, right? The apocryphal story of George Washington
Killed the
chopping
tree.
the cherry
Yeah.
tree, honest Abe.
Right.
The
We've
campaign's
always had it.
slogan. No, but that's been quite different
Right.
from the idea of honesty with celebrity, where it's all about self-disclosure. It's all, let me
Right.
tell you about me.
Right.
And I'll tell you about my love life, and I'll
Right.
tell you about my addiction, and
Right.
all,
Right.
whoa, whoa, whoa. But it's all about me, and that
Right.
honesty is just, kind of self-promotion rather than,
Integrity.
rather than integrity, which I would say is a print-oriented, a literate term for somebody who's not acting but is consistent in all of that they do, whereas being an actor is to play different roles and is all practically the opposite of consistency in that sense.
Which of the founding fathers had
Well,
integrity?
I really, we're kind of out of time, so last thoughts? Any final?
I want to
Other
know why
words?
you think Bernie was, your comments about sophistry.
Well, it's me. I'm following him for 25 years. I've heard him say what he said last night. I heard him say that 25 years ago. I don't think he's grown as a candidate.
That's interesting.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay, Jesse, final
I mean,
thought? Okay, we're Sal,
wrapping
Sal,
up.
we're, yeah.
Final thoughts, high stakes. I mean, I guess for a group who is so deeply concerned with the particulars of the words, I obviously didn't come prepared with like my word in my pocket,
That's
right?
okay.
Too.
That's all
But
right.
no, but
You had your word.
the way that words circulate is, I think, in the way that if things do not radically change, right, in the digital space, the things that are importantly structurally different or that append other institutions like journalism are to me kind of the processes that are more interesting than that word impeachment, but then like how does that circulate across various networks, and not just that it does lose meaning, but how does that meaning shift kind of maybe in 4 different ways, right, across these different spaces is, I think, the most kind of interesting thing about our current moment.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Okay, that's a good point, because the circulation of
Yeah.
language
Yeah.
has a lot to do with its meaning.
Right.
Yeah. Isabelle, would you have any last year? Good?
I'm good.
Okay. Well, I would like to note that our next session, our next program will be Wednesday, November 20th. Be quite different. It will be performances of poetry with, Adina Karasik will be here. Some of you know her. And also Bill Bissett, very major poet from Canada will be in
I thought it
town.
sounded like a name.
Yeah, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, so,
I did too.
and, part of it is a celebration for him, so, be sure to join us, in a month, and, thank you all for coming. Thank you to our audience.